You see what sending out them negative waves did, Moriarty?
But oddball, I did try and tell them, but they won't listen. I tried.
Sure.
But I did try.
Oh, man. Don't hit me with them negative waves so early in the morning.
But I can't force them to listen. I can't.
Always with the negative waves, Moriarty. Always with the negative waves.
Have a little faith, baby. Have a little faith.
But I keep trying. Oddball, I keep trying. But they won't listen. They won't tune in. They really won't.
Why don't you knock it off with them negative waves? Why don't you dig how beautiful it is out here? Why don't you say something righteous and hopeful for a change?
Tune in to Awake Radio for your positive waves.
Thank you for listening to Organic News here on Awake Radio, where we try to give you news that is organic. Thank you and welcome to another session of Organic News here on Awake Radio. We have actually live with us, and we're going to get right to it because he only has a half an hour. Jeff Cohen, professor at Ithaca University, Ithaca College, and it's the Park Center for Independent Journalism Department. You were at the event that I filmed on Saturday called The Full Disclosure, an honest commemoration of the American War in Vietnam, which was an amazing event. If I could just, I want to just talk about that performing artist really briefly that moved me unbelievably. I mean, even though the guy never uttered a word, I was so moved. And I like the pictures that I took of him, I'm like absolutely in love with.
Right.
And so why were you at this event? And the point of the event, I believe, is because I was informed that they're trying to recycle or sanitize the Vietnam War and like resell it like as if it was a just war. And right. So I believe that this event was put in place to counter any attempts at legitimizing the Vietnam War by the powers that be.
Yeah, I think what directly inspired this event is that President Obama has initiated Congress has appropriated the money, a 12-year-long 50th anniversary commemoration of the war. But as Obama said in his original remarks that began this commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Vietnam War, he talked about how the military fighting in Vietnam were upholding what he called American ideals.
Yep.
And so there's no doubt that there's a very big element of whitewash, of varnish, when a president talks about American ideals being upheld by the Vietnam War. It's exactly the kind of absurdity that people should resist, because if you can talk that ridiculously about a war that involves so much racism and so much mayhem against innocent civilians in Vietnam and so much hardship to the U.S. soldiers, many of whom were forced over there. We had a draft. If you can sort of sugarcoat what happened in Vietnam, I think the fear is by these groups that have initiated the counter commemoration that you can justify the ongoing or future wars. So that was the whole idea, I think, behind the event at Judson Memorial Church on Saturday, which is to challenge this notion that the Vietnam War was somehow about our highest American ideals. Only if you believe American ideals involve killing civilians and lying to the United States public and preventing an election that the United States knows that the communists in Vietnam would have won. if your ideals are lying and cheating and killing, I guess the Vietnam War was about ideals. But so that's the importance of a counter commemoration, is to tell the truth about what the Vietnam War was really about.
I would think today, and I guess it's not 100% true, but that most people it's a well-known fact that the Vietnam War was completely like a farce. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought like most people know that the Gulf of Tonkin, was a complete lie.
Yeah, I think that someone who spoke, I think it was one of the professors who spoke at this event, pointed out that as the years have gone on, that feeling you're talking about, that the Vietnam War was a waste, it was pointless, it should have been avoided, the number of people that believe that, and it was once huge, it keeps shrinking. So, if people's memories of or young people who weren't around at the time, if they're getting a more positive view toward the Vietnam War, that's very, very dangerous, and that's what the polls seem to be showing. I made the point in my remarks at Judson Memorial Church that in the late 70s, it was widespread among the U.S. public that the United States government is too quick to get involved in wars, too quick to send young Americans off into battle, and then quick, of course, to forget them when they return. That was widespread sentiment. That wasn't just left-wing sentiment, and it scared the hell out of the war makers, because it's what they called Vietnam syndrome, which was this fear among the broad American public that they would do this again, that they would start some other needless war. So there was definitely once a much huger percentage of the population that felt the Vietnam War was a nightmare and a disaster and a lie. But as the years go on, apparently that number is shrinking according to polls.
Yeah, we have to definitely keep it alive.
Yes.
A lot of the people that attended, actually one of the organizations that was part of putting this event on is the Veterans for Peace. And there were a lot of Vietnam vets attended this event. And I mean, if anyone knows that this war was a complete, it's hard to even find the right word to describe it, BS, farce, they do. It's the veterans themselves that know that it was not legitimate.
Yes, no doubt about it. And unfortunately, that generation, which is my generation, are dying. That's why it's important to pass this knowledge to the younger generation.
Right.
And I think it's why the Obama administration, or whatever administration succeeds Obama, why they're trying to rehabilitate the war, because, we are a country that's been in almost perpetual war for, the last decades. Now, the point I was making in my remarks is that there's another myth around Vietnam, and it's that an aggressive, independent mainstream media turned the public against the war. And the reality is that it was an aggressive, informed public that was informing itself in spite of the mainstream media by going to rallies, by going to teach-ins on campuses, by reading alternative and independent publications, by listening to things like WBAI back then and Pacifica Radio. By going through alternative channels, millions of people had come to the view that we needed to get out of the war and end it. But the mainstream media, up until 1968, 1969, and in some outlets way beyond that, were just cheerleaders for the war. And while, a good turning point, a good point to judge the reality that the U.S. mainstream media were largely biased in favor of the war and largely responsible for so many hundreds of thousands of U.S. young people going over to that war, a good marker was the Tet Offensive of January, February of 1968.
Yep.
That's when the National Liberation Forces has pretty much seized the U.S. Embassy. They'd made it onto the U.S. Embassy grounds. And it was around that time that although millions and millions and millions of average Americans had educated themselves and come to the position that the war had to stop and the soldiers had to come home, the Boston Globe did a survey of 39 leading United States dailies in February of 1968, and they could not find one daily that was editorializing in support of withdrawal of U.S. troops. So the reality is that in 1964, 65, 66, 67, 68, the mainstream media were largely censoring evidence of U.S. war crimes in Vietnam. They were largely cheerleading for the war. They made the South Vietnamese anti-communist government look like small d Democrats when they were actually dictatorial and authoritarians. So when you look at the role that the U.S. mainstream media played in generating that war and supporting that war, it's really horrifying, but that's the truth. And it wasn't until very, very late, when already millions of Americans had turned against the war, that you could get anything even remotely resembling criticism of the war in the mainstream media. And that criticism was usually very weak. For example, when Walter Cronkite announced in 1968 that he'd been to Vietnam and he now realizes the war was a stalemate. And, you know, when Cronkite, quote, criticized, unquote, the war, it was generally that it had taken so long, that it wasn't a winnable war, and it wasn't anything like the anti-war movement was saying at the time, which is this is a racist war, it's an immoral war, we're killing huge numbers of civilians, we shouldn't have been there in the first place. That kind of criticism was almost completely excluded from mainstream media. And, you know, one of the experts on that is Noam Chomsky. He talked about how when the mainstream media would have a debate about the war, it would be the hawks versus the doves, and the doves that were allowed into mainstream media debates were usually ones that said, look, we were well-intentioned, but the war's taken so long, so maybe we should consider maybe getting out. I mean, that was your dovish poll in mainstream media. And the anti-war movement grew and grew and grew in spite of the mainstream media's bias.
I wonder sometimes, you know, what is the main objective? Like sometimes, I mean, like I was actually born right around or at the commencement of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, you know, I have to say, you know, no one really teaches you about this stuff. No one taught me anything about, you know, history or the civil rights movement or challenging authority, you know, challenging the system and having your rights. I mean, quite the opposite, I would actually say, you know, more along the lines of just going along with the system, you know, being like a cog in the wheel. And I tried to kind of rebel and fight against that as much as I could. And I wasn't met very well, I must add. But so what exactly, you know, it was between the North and the South of Vietnam. And the U.S. was fighting on behalf of the North against the South? No,
the South on behalf of the North. But the division of Vietnam into North and South was supposed to be temporary. The forces in Vietnam that had led the battle against the Japanese occupation of their country, that force was a nationalist force led by communists. It was known as the Viet Minh. And it was led by Ho Chi Minh, and they were considered patriotic heroes because they fought the Japanese during World War II. And when World War II ended, a lot of these nationalist movements in Asia that had fought Japanese conquest and occupation in alliance with the United States, in alliance with France, in alliance with Great Britain, they assumed, and they'd sort of been promised, that when World War II ended, these colonies would become independent.
Right.
And so Vietnam, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist, had expected that they would have an independent country. But rather than gaining their independence, the French, backed by the United States, said, no, we're going to remain, Vietnam's going to remain a colony of France. And so the Viet Minh, who had patriotically fought to liberate their country from the Japanese, battled to get the French out. And when the Vietnamese movement, it was from north to south, there was only one thing called Vietnam. And when they had fought the French colonial army and defeated the French colonial army, and they were hugely popular in the nation of Vietnam, and not just by communists. All, the people in Vietnam had seen this movement that was led by communists as their patriotic nationalist movement that was driving the French out. And when the French were about to be driven out, the United States started supporting the French war effort with huge amounts of money. And then when the French were finally driven out, and Vietnam thought that they were going to be an independent country, the United States stepped in and sort of formed a puppet regime in the South that was an anti-Viet Minh, a group that had been sort of against the communist-led movement that had liberated Vietnam from French colonialism, and the U.S. sort of created a puppet regime in South Vietnam. And when when the fighting stopped in 1956, there was an international peace conference about Vietnam at Geneva, and or it might have happened in 54, 55, and it called for elections. The South remained sort of U.S.-supported, anti-communist. The North was the movement, governed by the movement that had actually led the unified national opposition to French colonialism. They were told that there would be an election supervised by international authorities and international peacekeepers, that there would be an election that would determine the future of Vietnam. And we know from the Pentagon Papers that were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg that the United States prevented that election from ever happening because, I think in the words of then President Eisenhower, the Vietnamese communists would have won 80% of the vote in a free election. That's what they were saying internally. But to the U.S. public, they made it seem like the Vietnam War was a war for democracy against communist terrorists that the Vietnamese did not support. The reality is, if the U.S. had allowed elections, but they blocked them, the Vietnamese communists would have won an overwhelming victory. I know of no expert on Vietnam who believes anything different, that if free elections had not been blocked by the United States government, there's no one I know who knows anything about Vietnam who believes anything different than the Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh would have won a massive victory. And so that's how we got the U.S. war. They came in on behalf of a puppet regime that they had established in the 50s, and they went in first with advisors under John Kennedy in the early 60s, and then after the Gulf of Tonkin hoax that you mentioned in August 1964, that's when U.S. soldiers began to pour into Vietnam, ultimately going to 500,000 soldiers would be stationed there at one time. And that's how we got the Vietnam War. There was no South or North Vietnam.
You mentioned, I was going to bring it up too, the Pentagon Papers. And so that's what Daniel Ellsberg was trying to expose, was the fact that the U.S. blocked these elections.
Yes.
That was
the Pentagon Papers were released by Dan Ellsberg early 1970s. And the Pentagon Papers was thousands of pages of an internal study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense to figure out how did we get into Vietnam and what went wrong. And so it was a very in-depth look internally. They never thought, it was just for their own benefit. It wasn't to be public. They wanted it internally. What were the mistakes that we made? What went wrong? How did we get caught in this quagmire? So it was a very honest internal investigation. And what it revealed was that 4 presidents in a row, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, had basically lied to the American public about things like who the Vietnamese supported and who they didn't, how many people supported the Vietnamese communist and liberation fighters that were fighting against the U.S., how popular those people were, the people that we called enemy terrorists who were terrorizing the Vietnamese people were actually the popular force in Vietnam. And the U.S. presidents knew all this and told the American public a lie.
So it was in the Pentagon Papers, the truth, but they weren't revealing that to the people.
Right. It was completely an internal study. Ellsberg had a high security clearance. He was able to see this study. He contributed some of it. He wrote some of the history. But then when he got his hands on the whole thing, he was thinking to himself, there are young people resisting the draft and burning their draft cards and using nonviolent resistance and willing to go to prison for years to try to spread the word about this racist, immoral Vietnam War. And here I'm sitting on dynamite. I have this document, these thousands of pages of history with supporting documents from the time that shows the U.S. presidents have been lying one after another to try to sell the Vietnam War, that they knew that we weren't wanted in Vietnam. They knew that the Vietnamese liberation forces were popular. He's sitting on this documentation that he believes could expedite the end of the war, but he knows that if he releases these top secret papers, he will face life imprisonment. And because he was inspired by young people that were going off to jail for 2, 3, 4, 5 years for refusing to go to Vietnam, he said, if these young people have such bravery, why don't I? And that's what led him. I know Dan Ellsberg pretty well. I've heard his story. I've read his books. I've talked to him personally. And he made a commitment inspired by people half his age. He said, I'm going to face the consequences. So he first tried to get senators to take these papers and make them public. They wouldn't.
Right.
Then he went to the news media, and finally the New York Times started releasing the papers on their front page. And when they were enjoined by a judge that they couldn't do that anymore, Ellsberg had made multiple copies of these papers. He then leaked them to the Washington Post, which started running them. When the Post was stopped, Ellsberg had provided papers to the St. Louis Post, the Boston Globe, and it was because as soon as one newspaper was stopped from running the papers, another newspaper would continue, that those papers ultimately came out in full, and they did play a huge role in bringing that war to an end much faster than it would have ended without the Pentagon Papers, and Dan risked life in prison. Luckily, the charges were thrown out.
Thank God for that. And, again, like what I just, I understand it, but then I don't understand, the media and not wanting to publish these things. And
Well, the point is that by the time the Pentagon Papers came out, 70, 71, the public had basically opened up the mainstream media. You know what I mean? It was those millions of people that were expressing their opposition to the war, even when the New York Times and Washington Post were editorially supporting the war pretty strongly. By 1970, 71, it was hard for any newspaper to keep defending the war. And so when the Pentagon Papers were offered to them, they published them. And it was a very brief, very unusual time where mainstream media, because they knew the public had turned against the war in spite of them,
So then
they knew, they did stand up against the Nixon administration. And it was a brief, shining moment where mainstream media had done what journalists are supposed to do, which is, act on behalf of the public and not act on behalf of the governing elites.
Right. And so it seems that maybe like a good way to, keep alive the fact that the Vietnam War, wasn't this just war, is to keep Dan Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers,
Yes.
To keep that. I mean, because,
well, there's a wonderful,
proof.
There's a wonderful documentary.
Yeah, I watched
about Dan Ellsberg. That's
yeah.
what any young person that wants to know what it is we're talking about with Vietnam, and it's called The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. I think you can get it on Netflix.
Yeah,
that's what when young people ask me about the Vietnam War, I say watch that movie.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite movies. I was actually sitting at the edge of my seat while I was watching it, and thank goodness he was someone that I always wanted to meet. Like, he was on my list of like persons that I have to meet.
Right.
And when they had the hearing, the appeal hearing, I think it was for the National Defense Authorization Act, I got to meet Daniel Ellsberg, right in front of the courthouse down in Lower Manhattan, and then they had a panel afterwards in I think it's called the Lynn Redgrave Theater in Lower Manhattan, and Michael Moore was there. So I got to interview Daniel Ellsberg briefly at that event also, and so I'm happy about that. And so I just quickly before you have to go, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned Ronald Rittenauer.
Yes.
When you were speaking, and I just wanted you to talk about him a little bit.
Yes, okay. Ronald Rittenauer, Dan Ellsberg was not the only brave whistleblower that exposed internal atrocities of the Vietnam War and was ready to suffer the consequences. Ronald Rittenauer was a Vietnam veteran, and before he got out of Vietnam, he started hearing about the My Lai massacre, this massacre of hundreds of civilians in a village, old people, babies, and he started talking to other soldiers that were there. He started gathering documents. Within a couple months of the massacre, which was, I believe, March of 1968, Rittenauer was taking this evidence with names, with dates, with times, to one mainstream news outlet after another, and they wouldn't touch the story. And Rittenauer persisted and persisted, and finally he located a very independent journalist named Seymour Hersh.
Right.
And Seymour Hersh brought this story out in an alternative small news outlet called Dispatch News Service. Right. And they timed the release of it for November 1969 in advance of a massive moratorium march on Washington. And so here was a story that Ronald Rittenauer, a Vietnam vet, and he ended up becoming an investigator and a journalist himself, but Rittenauer had pieced together this horrible massacre, and the mainstream media wouldn't cover it. So finally, Seymour Hersh brought it out, and the important thing for us to remember is that when you hear someone claiming that the mainstream media was independent and aggressive and critical during the heart of the Vietnam War, they often will cite as Exhibit A, well, look, the mainstream media published the My Lai massacre. Well, the reality is that the mainstream media bottled it up, and it didn't come out, thanks to Seymour Hersh, aggressive work, it didn't come out until 20 months after the massacre actually happened.
Right.
Well, imagine if the My Lai massacre story had come out 2 months after, when Ridenour was pushed, or 3 months. Our war may have ended. A bunch of innocent civilians may not have been killed. It could have really mattered, but the mainstream media bottled it up. So, yeah, Ron Ridenour was another heroic figure during the Vietnam era, and finally he got that story out.
So, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question. Maybe I'm just thinking out loud, but what is the point of killing innocent civilians in a war?
Well, I just think in order to understand how that happened, and I've only got a few seconds, but in order to understand that, you have to understand that the best book on that is called Kill Everything That Moves.
Right.
It's a new book by Nick Turse, T-U-R-S-E. And, the soldiers were told that body counts is what they need. We need to be killing the enemy, and we need to have large numbers of kills. And it was hard to kill the Vietnamese enemy because they actually lived there and they knew how to hide. This was their land, and they could hide in the jungles. Right. And so a lot of times the U.S. soldiers would be ambushed. And there was a lot of racism against Vietnamese, and there was a lot of anger and rage among U.S. soldiers. And sometimes that rage, and it's all shown in the Nick Turse book, the new book, and that's all based on documentation, that sometimes the U.S. soldiers would blow a fuse, and they would start killing innocent people. And then they would tell their supervisors, their superiors, we've killed 200 enemy soldiers here in this village, when actually they had killed 200 innocent civilians. So there was a real drive from the top of the command structure to get more and more kills, have more and more dead people. And so a lot of civilians were victimized in this drive to have a major kill list, a kill count, a body count. That's it.
It seems, and I know you have to go.
Yeah, I have to run.
Okay.
I have another appointment. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
I was just going to add, while Jeff is leaving us, that it seems like a theme that's going on currently, that, no one has the balls to go after, the big guy. I mean, even here, it's like, taking on the corporations, everyone's attitude is like, oh, it's done. Oh, it's been going on. Like the rich have been enslaving the masses for so long, it's impossible. And so the innocent, the most innocent are always the ones suffering, not just in war, but, like anywhere, it seems. So I just wanted to make that sort of observation. And so with that, we're just going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I was going to play Jeff Cohen's talk from Saturday at the Full Disclosure American War in Vietnam. And then also Deborah Sweet's talk after that, who I recently learned that she got an award from Richard Nixon. And well, I'll let Deborah Sweet say it in her talk. So we'll be back in a minute.
You're listening to Awake Radio. Straight talk for the awake and aware.
Okay, we are back. Thank you for still tuning in. So I'm just going to get right to it. Here's Jeff Cohen's talk on Saturday at the Full Disclosure American War in Vietnam.
Thank you. It's clear today that the U.S. anti-war movement during Vietnam, especially the Vietnam veterans against the war, scared the hell out of the war-making elites. Late 1970s, there was a huge fear in elite circles that broad public sentiment had taken hold, a consensus that the government was ready to send people off to war in large numbers. organizations and alternative media. But the sentence scared the hell out of the elites. And they worried about what they call Vietnam syndrome or Vietnam paralysis that might interfere with future military adventures. And the pundits in the mainstream media worried, especially this new group that was called the neoconservatives, the neocon intellectuals, who were at that time trying to put Ronald Reagan in the White House. Now, neocons are always cheerleaders for war. And like most cheerleaders, they can always be found in their loved ones on the sidelines and not on the field of battle. And the effort to rehabilitate the Vietnam War and defeat Vietnam syndrome began in earnest in 1980, when then candidate Ronald Reagan went to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in Chicago, and he cut against this consensus by declaring that the U.S. war in Vietnam had been a, quote, noble cause. And a decade later, at the end of the Gulf War, President Bush I was boasting, my God, we kicked Vietnam syndrome once and for all. So that's 15 years after the U.S. exit from Saigon, but the fear of Vietnam syndrome was still on the minds of U.S. leaders. And the attempt to rehabilitate the Vietnam War continues today with Obama's 50th commemoration and the platitudes from Obama, and the claim from Obama that the U.S. military was fighting in Vietnam, and I'm quoting, to protect the ideas we hold, to protect the ideals we hold dear as Americans. Today we see Obama waging a war against whistleblowers who leak documents about war crimes, about torture, spying, and it's easy to understand why. Because in order for leaders to get away with the ludicrous comments Ronald Reagan made in 1980 about Vietnam, or Obama's been making recently about Vietnam, or the absurd claims we're hearing about the wars that are going on today, it's important that the public not access the official record. They want the public to live in this fantasy land, whereas we don't have access to any of these internal documents, like the ones that Daniel Ellsberg leaked, the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg was just one of many heroic Vietnam-era whistleblowers. I look at the Vietnam Veterans Against the War as a group of whistleblowers. They were to a government misconduct, government policy that was abusive, and they talked about it. Now, Obama's comments about Vietnam only make sense if we don't have access to the Pentagon Papers, because if we do have access to the Pentagon Papers, American ideals can only mean killing innocent civilians, lying to the U.S. public, preventing to talk about and confront a crucial myth that's still believed today. It's the myth that there was a truly independent, aggressive mainstream media that turned the public against the war. The reality is exactly the opposite. It was the anti-war activities of brave Americans, whether it's students, returning Vietnam vets, Black and Latino organizations, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali, Dr. Benjamin Spock. It was these Americans, it was the public that opened up the media and turned the public against the war in spite of the media, which had been pro-war from the early 1960s to late 1968, 69, and in some outfits even beyond. Far from the nonsense about Vietnam being the first uncensored war or the first televised war, the mainstream media up to 1969 were almost exclusively censored. They were repeatedly given evidence of U.S. war crimes, and they suppressed that evidence. When you hear the myth makers talk about their imagined, independent mainstream media that turned the public against the war, Exhibit A is always the My Lai massacre. Now, it's pretty hard to ignore the massacre of hundreds of civilians in a single village, but that's what the mainstream media did for almost a year, for more than a year and a half. When did the My Lai massacre happen? March of 1968. And immediately, Ron Ridnow, the Vietnam veteran and the heroic quote, whistleblowers taking evidence of the Levi massacre to one U.S. mainstream media outlet after another. And at every single one, they turned him away. They would not touch the story. It wasn't until November 1969, 20 months after the massacre happened, that the story finally came out. It was Seymour Hersh in an alternative small news outlet called Dispatch News Service, and was released to coincide with the massive moratorium march on Washington. So you had anti-war upsurge was responsible for this story getting out after the mainstream media had suppressed it for so long and kept it under wraps. Go back to the Tet Offensive of January, February 1968. By this point, millions of Americans had educated themselves through campus teach-ins, rallies, the returning vets. They were calling for withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. February 1968, the Boston Globe did a survey of the 39 leading dailies in the United States. They could not find one daily that was editorializing in support of the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Public consciousness in spite of the mainstream media. When Martin Luther King broke his silence and he went uptown to the Riverside Church in April of 1967, and he made a speech against Vietnam, against foreign policy. He declared that the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He was savaged by the mainstream media. He was savaged by the New York Times. Life magazine called his speech demagogic slander that sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. The Washington Post patronized King has diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, to his people. And think about the original lie that we've heard already. The Gulf of Tonkin hoax of August 1964 that claimed that not one, but there was two unprovoked attacks on U.S. destroyers. This was almost as transparently a lie as all of the lies 40 years later that drove us into the Iranian invasion. The skeptical independent journalist I.F. Stone was poking holes in that lie the week that the story came out. But the blaring headlines in the mainstream media, whether it was the big newspapers or the nightly network news, this is what the Washington Post said. Headline: American planes hit North Vietnam after second attack on our destroyers. Move taken to halt new aggression. Decades after Tonkin, my writing partner Norman Solomon went to these mainstream media to see if anyone had retracted it. He could find not a single retraction of this inaccurate and lethal coverage. But he did find Murray Marder, the Washington Post reporter, who had written most of the inaccurate coverage for the front pages of the Washington Post. And he asked Murray Marder about it, and Murray said, quote, I can assure you there was never any retraction. If you were making a retraction, you have to retract virtually everyone's entire coverage of the Vietnam War. And then Murray Marder said, if the American press had been doing its job and the Congress had been doing its job, we would never have been involved in the Vietnam War. This is from a guy whose credulous page one journalism in one of the most influential days helped expand the Vietnam War. I want to finish with two quick anecdotes. First,
Hugh Thompson.
In 1960,
Hugh Thompson, you forgot him.
Pardon me?
Hugh Thompson, you forgot him.
Hugh Thompson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. In 1965 and 1966, I was 14, 15 years old. I was a news nerd. I watched the nightly news every night. I read Time magazine every week. I prided myself on being a kid who really knew what was happening in the world. And based on everything I knew from the mainstream media, I was a gung-ho Vietnam War. I wrote a paper in the 10th grade for social studies attacking the football star Joe Namath, whose bad name kept him out of Vietnam. My exact words were, Namath is healthy enough to play one of the roughest sports on earth, but not to defend his country in Vietnam. Where did I get such a whacked out idea that fly to the other side of the globe to attack a peasant society that had no animus to us and could not hurt us if it did have animus toward us, that somehow that was defending our country. I got that nutty idea, and millions of other Americans from the media, as did kids that were just a few years older than me that were going off to Vietnam. That was the 10th grade. I had never heard of I.S. Weekly. I had never heard of Ramparts Magazine or the Alternative Press. Luckily for me, before I graduated from high school, I found these alternative publications, and they turned my world and my worldview upside down. If you wonder why I'm so fanatical about independent media, that's my job at Ithaca College in the journalism department. It's because independent media changed my life and perhaps saved my life. So in early 1971, I'm in Detroit where I grew up, and the Vietnam veterans against the war were having winter soldier years. And my dad vehemently against the war at 19 years old. I was doing the little I could to help. And one Vietnam veteran after another was getting up on stage with the most moving speakers I've ever heard in my life. About the horrors they experienced, the atrocities against Vietnamese civilians that they'd seen or participated in. Some of them talked about how the mainstream media had deceived them and going over in the first place. And I was sitting there thinking, if this testimony could get out to the public, this war that's dragging on year after year after year after tomorrow, but the mainstream media weren't there. And there was one rare mainstream media camera crew that showed up ever so briefly. They were there, I think, for less than 20 minutes. And in those days, you didn't have a little camera. You know, in those days, you had a huge camera, tripod, sound equipment, you had lights, and they started being there just a few minutes. They started collapsing all their equipment, putting it away in boxes. And a room full of Vietnam veterans watches and their friends and loved ones. Watches as the one mainstream media around the world, and then the veterans and the people there started jeering and booing the mainstream media. That was the moment I became a media critic for life. And I think there's two lessons that I'm taking away from the Vietnam War experience. One, we need to build independent media. The good news is independent media have more reach, more power, more professionalism today by far than they ever did during the height of the Vietnam War. And it's largely because of the internet, and the internet needs to be safe from corporate predators. And the second lesson I learned is we have to support groups like Veterans for Peace, like Veterans Against the War, because without these groups, the anti-war movement is ruthless. Thank you very much.
Right, so I was telling support me. I'm independent media. Yeah, all these videos can be found on my YouTube channel, April, like this month, and Waters, Watters. And that man, there was a man kind of to my left that was yelling out, Hugh Thompson, and I looked up who he was. Hugh Clowers Thompson Jr., born April 15th, 1943 till January 6th, 2006. He was a United States Army helicopter pilot during the Vietnam War. He is best known for his role in stopping the My Lai massacre, in which a group of U.S. Army soldiers tortured, raped, and killed several hundred unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mutilating their bodies after they'd been murdered. Although initially ill-treated in some quarters for their intervention, Thompson and his crew, Glenn Andreotta and Lawrence Colburn, were recognized and decorated many years later for their heroism at My Lai. Andreotta had died in combat 3 weeks after the massacre, and so was honored posthumously. It talks about the My Lai massacre. In the early morning of March the 6th, 1968, Thompson, OH-23, encountered no enemy fire over Mile 4. Spotting two possible Viet Cong suspects, he forced the Vietnamese to surrender and flew them off for a tactical interrogation. Thompson also marked the location of several wounded Vietnamese with green smoke, a signal that they needed help. Returning to the Mile area at around 0900 after refueling, he noticed that the people he had marked were now dead. Out in a paddy field beside a dike 200 meters, 660 feet south of the village, he marked the location of a wounded young Vietnamese. Thompson and his crew watched from a low hover as Captain Ernest Medina, commanding officer of C Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, came up to the woman, prodded her with his foot, and then shot and killed her. Thompson then flew over an irrigation ditch with dozens of bodies. Shocked at the sight, he radioed his accompanying gunships, knowing his transmission would be monitored by many on the radio net. It looks to me like there's an awful lot of unnecessary killing going on down there. Something ain't right about this. There's bodies everywhere. There's a ditch full of bodies that we saw. There's something wrong here. Movement from the ditch indicated to Thompson that there were still people alive in there. Thompson landed his helicopter and dismounted. David Mitchell, a sergeant and squad leader in 1st Platoon C Company, walked over to him. When asked by Thompson whether any help could be provided to the people in the ditch, the sergeant replied that the only way to help them was to put them out of their misery. 2nd Lieutenant William Cawley, commanding officer of C Company, then came up and the two had the following conversation. Thompson, what's going on here, Lieutenant? Cawley, this is my business. Thompson, what is this? Who are these people? Cawley, just following orders. Thompson, orders? Whose orders? Cawley, just following ... Thompson, but these are human beings, unarmed civilians, sir. Cawley, look, Thompson, this is my show. I'm in charge here. It ain't your concern. Thompson, yeah, great job. Cawley, you better get back in that chopper and mind your own business. Thompson, you ain't heard the last of this. Thompson took off again, and Andriata reported that Mitchell was now executing the people in the ditch. Furious, Thompson flew over the northeast corner of the village and spotted a group of about 10 civilians, including children, running toward a homemade bomb shelter. Pursuing them were soldiers from the 2nd Platoon C Company. Realizing that the soldiers intended to murder the Vietnamese, Thompson landed his aircraft between them and the villagers. Thompson turned to Colburn and Andriata and told them that if the Americans began shooting at the villagers or him, they should fire their M60 machine guns at the Americans. Y'all cover me. If these bastards open up on me or these people, you open up on them. Promise me. He then dismounted to confront the 2nd Platoon's leader, Stephen Brooks. Thompson told him he wanted to help get the peasants out of the bunker. Thompson, hey, listen, hold your fire. I'm going to try to get these people out of this bunker. Just hold your men here. Brooks, yeah, we can help you get them out of that bunker with a hand grenade. Thompson, just hold your men here. I think I can do better than that. Brooks declined to argue with him, even though as a commissioned officer, he outranked Thompson. After coaxing the 11 Vietnamese out of the bunker, Thompson persuaded the pilots of the two UH-1 Huey gunships, Dan Millions and Brian Livingstone, flying as his escort to evacuate them. While Thompson was returning to base to refuel, Andriata spotted movement in an irrigation ditch filled with approximately 100 bodies. The helicopter again landed and the men dismounted to search for survivors. After wading through the remains of the dead and dying men, women, and children, Andriata extracted a live boy named Duba. Thompson flew the survivor to the ARVN hospital in Quang Nang. I don't know if I'm saying that right. QUANGNGAI. Upon returning to their base at about 11 a.m., Thompson heatedly reported the massacre to his superiors. His allegations of civilian killings quickly reached Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker, the operations overall commander. Barker radioed his executive officer to find out from Captain Medina what was happening on the ground. Medina then gave the ceasefire order to Charlie Company to knock off the killing. So that is from Wikipedia. Hugh Thompson Jr., helicopter pilot that saved or put a stop to the My Lai massacre. So with that, we're going to go to another break, and then after the break, we're going to have Bishop George Packard, who was also a Vietnam veteran, who was arrested with the Occupy movement. So please don't go away, and I'll play the Deborah Sweet talk from the event on Saturday at the last half an hour of the show. Thank you. Please stick around. Welcome back to Organic News here on Awake Radio, and we have with us on the phone Bishop George Packard, who I've been wanting to have you on for, I don't know, at least a year, if not even longer than that, when you were one of the ones that got arrested with Occupy. I think it was for climbing the fence at the Trinity Church protest, wasn't it, George?
It might have been. Yeah, we've been in contact over the months and different actions and demonstrations. So nice to be with you finally.
Yes. Great. Thank you for being able to be on. I pretty much, called you like just a couple of hours ago. But you were at this event on Saturday, and you spoke at this event, which I really like this event a lot. And I was like I told Jeff Cohen was on before you at 6.
Oh, great! Great!
And I was telling him, how moving that performance artist was, and even though he didn't say a word, I loved that performance artist, and the pictures I took of him were amazing.
Yes.
And so you were in the Vietnam War. Do you want to talk about your experience there?
Well, I can. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about it. Many Vietnam veterans prefer, just to let it drift off into the mist of memory. In this particular case, the Veterans for Peace wanted to make a statement about that war and offer some conclusions. And when they arrived at that moment, they realized there were no conclusions to be made, really. Why were we in that war? Why are we in any war? And more personally, Vietnam veterans, would you like to give testimony about how you feel about the truth of that war? And as I searched my conscience to what I was going to say, I thought to myself, there's not a lot of truth to that war. As a matter of fact, there's not much truth to a whole variety of combat operations that America has committed to. I served in the Episcopal Church. I'm retired now, as the bishop for the Armed Forces and Federal Ministries. And in that capacity, we talked about I helped to serve chaplains, and I was really the chaplain to the chaplains. And the question about just war always came up. What really is a just war? And I think that by the end of my term in that office, I retired in 2010. I served a little over 10 years. I don't think I could come up with a reasonable explanation for just war. It was as it was classically presented by Michael Walzer and others, that just war, particularly as it's as war is executed these days, is so toxic, Catherine, and so awful. The battle areas are so lethal that any war is immediately, as Chris Hedges speaks about so eloquently, immediately translated into a whole raft of incidents of collateral damage, so-called. That is, civilians, mothers and children, dying in a war zone. I have a memory of that, and I'm haunted by my participation in the Vietnam War. I have nightmares, even to this day. I had one last month, and it's understandable that I would have them. These haunting thoughts about what I have done with my life and how I have taken life. So back to the Veterans for Peace, and they're wanting to, find out what truth there was in the Vietnam War. I think that we come up with an empty pail when we try to empty basket when we try to reason that through. Maybe you should ask me some specific questions about the Vietnam War. So for me, it's a little like talking about the ocean, because I was so committed to it for an entire year.
So the whole purpose of the event that they had on Saturday, I also asked this to Jeff Cohen just to clarify, was because, it's coming up like the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War.
That's right.
It was 50 years ago, and they, I just call them the powers that be. So they're trying to, make the Vietnam War and the current war that's going on seem like it was a just war. Like they're trying to, repackage it and resell it again as if it was some kind of, a just, democratic war. And so this event was being put on by the Veterans for Peace and the Iraq Veterans Against the War and the Brooklyn for Peace organization in order to try to counter any attempt at our government and military to try to make any legitimacy out of the Vietnam War. And that was a great expression you just used, repackaging it and reframing it, trying to spray perfume around this rather loathsome experience in our country's history. I mean, I lost a very good friend, Tony Farrick, a machine gunner of mine. I was an infantry platoon leader. I wasn't a chaplain in those days. I was a grunt, and I lost a machine gunner, Tony Farrick, in that war. He's a young guy from Milwaukee, and he's on the wall. His name is inscribed on the wall in the Vietnam Memorial in the mall in Washington, D.C. And I was in contact with his family a year or so ago because his nephews wanted to know what was Uncle Tony like, and it was a very emotional phone call trying to retrieve these thoughts that we were in our 20s. And what he was even younger than that, and I wondered aloud with them. Well, I didn't want to add to their pain of missing their uncle, but
after the phone call, I wondered aloud, what was the reason for a war of that kind, a land war in Southeast Asia, to turn back the tide of communist aggression? I mean, it's amazing the life and treasure that we lost. Not to mention what we've done to the Vietnamese people. I mean, to this day, I think they're harvesting the bad and ill and awful effects of this war, even in the aftermath of Agent Orange exposures and all of those things. So I mean, it's a really painful memory. I think that the Veterans for Peace, and you just, I want to compliment you. You really gave a great description to what we should be doing and kind of countering the repackaging of the memory of this war.
You know, what I've been really, trying to stress to people for most of my life is, we really have to be diligent. I mean, the American people are really, really complacent. It's so funny. You must have been reading my mind, because I was literally thinking of Chris Hedges, and then you said his name, because I was just watching like 2 talks with him on YouTube, and he talks about his experiences in war, just and he was really honest at this one point. Again, like, I forget exactly, like, where he was. Sarajevo, I think maybe he said.
Yeah, he was in Bosnia, right.
Yeah, and he was talking about, just nearly getting away with his life. Like, these soldiers had taken him and maybe someone else in a Jeep, and that was it. Like, he thought they were just going to drive him. He could feel that they were being driven off the road, like into the desert, because the Jeep kind of started getting all, unsteady. And that was it. Like, he thought they were going to just drive him off the road out into the desert and then just blow their brains out. And he said when he was able to make it, like, to come that close to like death, and then, to come out of it. And, of course he said he was praying to, to God, like, please, if you get me out of this, like, I'll never do it again.
Right.
And that it's an addiction. Like, he said that once he got out of it, it was like such a rush, like an addiction, and, what I don't understand, though, is what is the, like, okay, so if you were the one nearly being killed and got out of it, as an addiction, but what is the addiction to kill innocent people like that? I don't see how can any, like, healthy person get off on that. I
think there's a whole training aspect. When you go in the military, you are trained to depend and survive on your group. It's translated into your platoon, and there's an intense feeling about that. I would visit Iraq veterans who were evacuated out off to German hospitals, and they wouldn't have any leg below the knee because of the IEDs that had blown up in their vehicles. A lot of the injuries in that war came from below. Other wars came from to the side and from above or behind, but most of the injuries come from to the lower extremities. And so I'm talking to this young Marine, and he's fully aware of the fact that he only has one leg. But the only thing, Catherine, he could think about was getting back to his buddies back in country. I'm thinking to myself, there's no way this kid's going anywhere but home. But the only thing he could get through his brain was getting back to be with his friends. And so when you talk to people in Afghanistan or Iraq, they don't have any kind of sense of national pride. They have a sense of their unit pride, their commitment to their mission, right where they are, right, within their immediate radius. So I don't think they necessarily get into a fever or an addiction, as you were putting it, to killing. There's not a high to that, but there is a kind of there is a high to trying to protect your own, and so that and the military depends on that. It depends on taking. It doesn't take older men like me into the military. It takes young men who are impressionable, who follow orders, who can be. If you, as a matter of fact, in basic and advanced training in any one of the military branches, if you don't accommodate yourself to this way of thinking, you're usually filtered out of the system. There's very, very few who do that, but sooner or later, it determines, can you follow orders? Can you stay in line? Can you march together? All those tiresome, monotonous activities are meant to make you less of an individual and more of a group.
See, that's
what's the sinister part to me, Catherine? The sinister part to me is that this country, it uses this kind of mindset to do its foreign policy. Yeah. It is absolutely zany. If you ask today the average American where the Ukraine is, many of them wouldn't be able to answer your question. They wouldn't even know where it is on the map. They wouldn't be able to find it on the map. And they wouldn't even be able to find Iraq or Afghanistan on the map to this day, even though we have units fighting and receiving fire in Afghanistan right at this as we're having this conversation. I fully believe that there's probably somebody receiving fire or somewhere in that country. But the United States, people in the United States have no sense of that. They have no sense of sacrifice, and they have no sense of identity. But yet we just kind of let our politicians throw out these troops and throw out this hardware, and mostly use this toxic, this battle array to turn environments into, as I've said before, lethal areas, more lethal, so that the safety of American troops is protected. I mean, it's probably the most mentally cruel way to do not only foreign policy, but it's mentally cruel not only to the people receiving the foreign policy, but it's mentally cruel to the people who are executing the foreign policy. These people are, the young men and women in the military today are from small town America. And if you've ever watched any of the sad roll calls at the end of the news programs, I think PBS is the only one that still does it. Now here are the names lost in combat, and we give you their names in silence. And you read read the names of those kids or young men. Usually there'll be a sprinkling of 40 or 50-year-olds in there from activated National Guard or Reserve units, but for the most part, they're in their 20s and very late teens or early 30s, and they're always from small towns in America. Yeah, those are the people that are doing the fighting, not the 1%. They don't, they're off doing, graduate schools and doing, very important things, and it's just a loathsome way to be as a country. I mean, you just start to, think living in Canada is preferable to your conscience and your and clear thinking.
That was going to bring me to my next, topic is, the breakdown of the family system and the fact that, the government is taking complete advantage of the fact that people don't really have, quality families that can really sort of offer them any sort of a future. And, it really is. It's like some, like dysfunctional love relationship where these young people, because, it's almost like they really need to believe in the military because they have nothing else. I mean, try telling someone who's in love, like, oh, that the person that they're in love with, did this, that, or the other thing. I mean, love is blind, so they don't really want to hear it. And sometimes, like, I really feel like it's the same thing with the military and people that have nothing else. And they really cling to this belief that the military and what they're fighting for, it's all they have in life. So without it,
well, I'm not sure I agree with that. The entirety of that conclusion. There's a very strong. Let me rephrase that. There's a significant element from lower middle income America in the military. There are many more who are from middle America who have always seen this as the American thing to do. Their fathers were in the military, their grandfathers were in the military. And their points of reference are patriotic. They may have limited vocational options so that they go into the military because of that. It's kind of a mixed bag if you start to talk to the pro, and I've spoken to a lot of servicemen and women over a decade of, traveling the globe and visiting their bases and stuff. So it's a very mixed bag. There is one verity that filters through all of this, though, and that is that we seem to have more in this war, even than in Vietnam. These two land wars in Southwest Asia. We were in Southeast Asia, now we're in Southwest Asia, in Iraq and Afghanistan. There seems to be a larger population of post-traumatic stress, which deteriorates into post-traumatic stress syndrome. And we're not really sure why that is. Why is the trauma from that? Maybe we're just better with the diagnostics. Often post-traumatic stress, everyone comes back. 90% of the people come back from these war areas, these battle areas, come back with some post-traumatic stress. And they don't necessarily have to be firing a weapon. You could be working in supply and logistics in the rear area and still have the traumatic effect, absorbed into your personality. But what happens is some people are prone to have these symptoms persist way on into their later life. I still have a nightmare or two. It's not arresting for I don't believe in the way I live, but some of these folks, even a good 10 years after Iraq War started, they're still persisting with some of these symptoms. I'm in a support group at the local VA hospital, so I see them regularly, and this is a population that is really beset by haunted, I should use that term carefully, by some of these memories, and and we're not really sure why this is. Some people believe that there's an element of guilt involved in the persistence of haunting memories of post-traumatic stress, and the guilt is that this war, these commitments to do these deeds, these evil deeds, are not justified. And we really know that somewhere deep down in our psyche. And that's the creepiest part of all of this. You know what I mean, Catherine? It really is creepy. If you think about it, somewhere deep inside of us, we really kind of know that what we did is really off center.
Well, that's
so
I did. It's just kind of interesting because I studied healing like most of my life. I was into health and fitness and alternative healing, meditation, yoga, and I even studied a bit about trauma and post-traumatic stress. There's a good book by Dr. Peter Levine called Waking the Tiger, and I think he really talks about how to get stress out of the nervous system and how he works with people. And it was one of my favorite books that I ever read.
Yeah.
Like if I could just say really quickly, like, one of my, again, like most passionate things that I, not very successfully, I might add, that I try to, talk about to people and teach people is our disconnection from the way that nature works and just being healthy and the way that our system is. And I'm gonna say directly, this whole notion of like just following orders goes in direct conflict to the way that nature works, because human beings are not meant to just blindly follow orders. I mean, it's part of the reason like why we exist is to be a unique individual. Like that's what I've been striving for like most of my life, because I studied, again, a lot about, abusive family systems, the dysfunctional, abusive relationships. And a real authority person, wants someone to think for themselves. Anyone who's a true authority, a true leader, is going to be encouraging people to to make decisions and to do thinking on their own and to not blindly follow orders. I mean, anyone that knows, abusive relationships knows that it's abusive to just blindly take orders or follow orders, no matter where it is, whether it's in your house, at work, or anywhere. It's not a true authority person that's going to be saying that. And, going back to, one of my greatest passions in the world that I write about in my blog all the time is being as connected to, nature, listening, for decades, I've been trying to facilitate and listen to my body, listen to how you feel, trusting your gut, trusting your gut instincts. That's what, people should be doing in wars, not going against what your gut says to listen to some person in authority. And I mean, I'm only kind of saying this stuff because, I didn't grow up in the greatest environment when I was a kid. I mean, I felt it pretty early in my life that, the people who were in charge of me were not real authority, and it was instinctual. It was instinctual in me as a young person, to challenge authority, which I did. And I, again, like I didn't get a lot of good pats on the back for it. I might add. I really got, quite the opposite. But I always knew deep down inside that I did the right thing, that my gut knew the truth. Just like you were just describing about the post-traumatic stress that, and that's what's like wrong with this world. It's like we get programmed, we get programmed away from what the gut knows, away from what nature knows, like if we get more in touch with our gut instincts and listen and slow down and take the time to develop more of a relationship, to ourselves and trusting what we feel is right. Then people might, hopefully start speaking more truth to power. Because, just like in the family system, it's normal and healthy, to break away from parents, to like fly out of the nest, not to have like the military kind of acting as like the parent that we just, can't get away from like for the rest of our lives. Like that's what I think about the system when I hear people talking about just following orders. I think of people who, still live at home when they're like in their 40s, that's what it reminds me of, really.
Well, I took us off in this direction when you were talking about, the elements of in the military, they don't have very many options, and as a whole entire class, they're really sort of drone-like going into the military. And I was saying it was more complicated than that. And and then I brought up post-traumatic stress to say that, as an example, that regardless of where you came from, whether you're middle-class American, it's patriotic, and Grandpa was in the military, or whether you're a working-class person and you don't have very many vocational options, everybody seems to be beset by the same issue as an individual. You will all have these same reflective, maybe guilty feelings of doing something wrong and out of character, maybe even evil. And here's the point that relates to what you're saying now about authority. I think that in the world, I notice even in Occupy, when we needed to move people around the city and trying to outfox the New York City Police Department, we needed to do that coordinating as a group of people. We weren't necessarily an army, but I would say we were a collaborative group. We were trying to work as individuals, but also as sort of a swarm, if you will. We weren't so much, we were trying to be an atmosphere more than we were trying to be a movement, so to speak. And I think that's what's happened, and I think this is true of today's soldier, sailor, Marine, Coast Guard member. I think they have more sentient power in these environments than they used to. And the reason I say that is that when I was speaking to the current Army Chief of Staff, whose name will come to me in a minute, I'm having a senior moment, but he said to me, he said, Bishop, we cannot talk to a military person in the same way that we used to. We have to accept and understand their intelligent, he didn't use the word sentient, but intelligent, independent person, because they bring that from the culture. And you think about it, there's a lot of stuff that is now transparent and is exposed immediately through social media that wasn't before. And so that kind of savviness is brought to the lifestyle of the military. Just because they move through the membrane into the military doesn't mean they all of a sudden leave their brains at the door. So that we have, very bright, intelligent, even good-humored people and young people in the military who, who drive these, multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar aircraft carriers across the Southwest Pacific. The people at the controls of these very large machines in the military are young men and women. They're not old, crusty characters who've been around a long time. They're individuals who have some preferences, independent thought, and they volunteer their accountability and their presence because they volunteered to do this, but for pay, and they're not paid well enough, but they have some individual agency that is being more displayed than their grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandparents did in the military. So it's a different kind of environment, and I think the military sort of understands that. You see, you're touching on something important in our culture that I have to really wrestle with. It's one of the reasons I've joined Occupy. You made reference to me trespassing on a Trinity Church property. I trespassed on Trinity Church property because I felt the corporate structure was so oppressive and so wanted us all to be robot-like in our responses. It couldn't figure out that right at it, and it's always preaching nearly every Sunday how they want to fill the pews and reach out to young people. And here's an entire mass of young people needing a home, and we just wanted to use a vacant lot. But the church, because it had already decided in its corporateness to decide what it wanted to do with something, it, as an institution, it decided for us. And I think that's balderdash. Why do you? Who says that you decided for us? I mean, who died and left you the prince of the world? I mean, I just think it's this kind of there's a Walter Wink, who's a theologian, who writes about the system is really the hidden empire. And the system is, big banks, Penn State, it's even the Roman Catholic Church, when it doesn't admit to the loathsome things it does to young people by its priests. Any institution that gets too big for itself is really is not transparent, and that includes the military, and that includes the federal government. It just accumulates power to itself, and it takes all of the agency and usurps all the agency and power of individuals. That's kind of, you're making that sort of point, I think, that who said a family necessarily has an authority over a young person? It doesn't. It has a collaborative warmth that it should wrap that young person in.
Because there is this need. I mean, everyone is born and kind of, grows up. I mean, I don't know if it's stronger in men. I mean, I know that I feel it too. To have honor, to have. I worked for the fire department in New York City, as EMS for like 6 years, because this desire to just, be honorable and really like do the right thing. And again, but right, like it doesn't take long. Like after you're doing it, I'm sure people, when they join the police department, it's the same thing. And, but when they find out that it's not really what they thought it was going to be, they don't always have the courage to admit it. And then by that time, you got a couple of kids and that's it. And you're sort of, you're stuck, like having to stay because you need the money.
You capitulated.
Yeah, like, and that's like, right. So, I mean, everyone is kind of in on sort of keeping this sort of theater alive, because they need the money, because they have kids and they have to take care of their kids. So bringing this back to the program theme that you called me about. I mean, so would Vietnam happen today? I don't know if it would. I know one thing that's different about the Vietnam era that's not happening today. You don't see people in the streets like you saw during the Vietnam era. I mean, people were so animated and aggravated. The country was aflame because they felt that there was a wrong direction. Now, when we walk into, saunter really into any one of a number of countries and start to swing our way around. America, we have zero investment in it, and although I think we'd have a very low toleration for anything in the Ukraine, but I still find Americans so unbelievably arrogant and self-satisfied that that's the part that I find so disturbing. In some ways, even though Vietnam was probably one of the most awful moments in our history, there was more conscience in those days as a reaction to the awfulness than there is today. I mean, other than What was do you remember what the response when Daniel Ellsberg exposed the Pentagon Papers? Like, what was the reaction of the people? I mean, was it like I mean, from what I know, there wasn't as much of an outrage when he exposed the Pentagon Papers.
No, there was a sense of alliance that the New York Times had taken his material and published it, and that's why it's sort of heartening to see that I think American people feel the same way about Edward Snowden, that we feel that and also Chelsea Bradley that this is that they've done a service for us. There's you know, I there from an armchair, Americans seem to get disturbed. I wish they got more disturbed about land war than they do about their personal cell phones being eavesdropped upon. But that's another matter. But I bet to answer your question about Daniel Ellsberg, there was a kind of a sense that you know, he's done something that we hoped would happen. You know, it's really hard to, it's, you know, when you try to think back 50 years what it was like, and 50 years or so, because the war lasted a few years, even though it started 50 years ago. It was, are we celebrating the end of the war or the beginning of the, I think we're celebrating the end of it. It's not what is it, 50 years from 1974, is it?
Was it, didn't the Vietnam War, like, yeah, right, it start in, like was it no, it wasn't the 50s, it was 60.
No, 1968.
Okay.
Yeah. We had people on the ground in Vietnam in 1966 during the Kennedy administration. So I think that the Veterans for Peace are noting the end of the war if it's 74. Maybe my math is bad, but and we'll get a critique from somebody who's listening to the show. But the point of this is that, you know, what was it like during that era? And
yeah, see, 1956 it started.
Are you looking it up? You're looking it up now?
Yeah. Also known as the Second Indochina War, was a Cold War era proxy war that occurred in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from December 1956 to the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975.
Okay, right, okay.
So it ended in 75. Like, right. So we're coming up on the end of it now. Tomorrow.
Yeah. So I think that I guess we're memorializing the great national sigh that occurred when helicopters. I mean, we left Vietnam with our tail between our legs. People were, you know, hanging off helicopters and being taken off to, you know, aircraft carriers offshore. It was just chaos, and and a number of films have depicted how it was. It was just, I remember I was home already and going about my life and tuning to the radio, and I had to pull over. You know, I mean, I thought to myself, what did I spend a year over there for? What was this? What was that? Why did we lose people? Why was that? Why, you know, 58,000 or so people? Why was that necessary? What was the reason for this again? And we did the same thing in Iraq. I mean, it's just trying to find weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's like we never learned a lesson.
Yeah, that's
it's amazing. It's amazing to me how we just kind of wander around the globe. Just kind of, I think Americans are figuring that this is not the way to be, mostly because we don't get the money to do it anymore. But I want to say that if we had the money, I think this nation would still do it. It's something, and I loved America, but there's something about our sense of entitlement and aggression and you know what we need to have. I mean, even our being greedy with natural resources.
It's almost just like an arrogance. It's just like a complete arrogance, and it goes unchecked. You know, so that's what I'm saying. Yes. Like when it goes unchecked, I mean, anything going unchecked. I mean, you know, I'm always just. You know, I think of just the laws of physics. I mean, anything, you know, like if I which I do sometimes quite often, you know, put some water on the stove, you know, want to like make some tea or something. I mean, if you forget about it, and you'll come back and the water will have evaporated, and if you forget about it still, the pot will start burning, and then after that happens, your whole stove will be on fire. And so
right.
Like that's when I go back to challenging authority and not listening to authority, and why it's so important for people to listen to your gut. I mean, it's not really like rocket science, to listen to your gut and to like know when, following, unjust, unlawful orders. I mean, of course you should do that. But see, that's just it. Like if young people don't have anybody teaching that to them, if young people don't see, that's the why I always talk about fitness and exercise. Like, you have to exercise your, yourself and your individuality. And the whole point really of authority is for authority to teach you so that you don't need them anymore. That is a real, true authority person, someone that wants you to break away. And fetuses don't live inside the womb indefinitely. They're there for 9 months and then they're born. There's a reason, like, nature has this process. You're born, they cut that cord, and, hopefully if you have some good parents or good teachers and leaders, throughout your life, that process is supposed to continue, and you're supposed to become more and more separate of an individual. You're not supposed to be, like a blur. You're not supposed to, not break away. You're supposed to break away. You're supposed to be your unique individual person. That's the way nature designed it to be, and still belong to a group. I mean, no one is completely independent, but, we're supposed to be unique individual people. We're not supposed to be a blur of, I think of the spinal cord, all my, my love for, yoga practice and everything, and alternative healing. It's like they talk about the spinal cord, and, after people get old, the vertebra, they start to degenerate and they fuse together. What makes a healthy spine is each of the vertebra individually being, having the ability to be mobile. It's a sign of a degenerative, unhealthy spine when the vertebrae start to fuse together, and then there's like more lack of mobility. Like, as human beings, and this is my love for like studying the family system and healthy relationships comes into play. Just healthy relationships are relationships where, people are allowed and encouraged to maintain their individuality. If you can't be an individual and think for yourself in a relationship, and you got to blindly follow orders, I'm sorry, but that's a sign of an abusive, dysfunctional relationship. And it's only because I kind of grew up in a not such a great environment that, it prompted me to just read. Like, I was, to just do all this research and get to the bottom of this, like, once and for all, because I listened to my gut and things that just didn't feel right to me. And I just, to me, like, healthy relationships are extremely, extremely important thing to, to understand. And I think people really don't know what they are, and signs and symptoms of dysfunctional or abusive relationships. And now,
how did you, when you remember EMS, I mean, there had to be some kind of organizational structure for that EMS group to function.
Right.
How do you? What's the magic? What's the fine line between giving up your individuality and throwing it in with the group that performs a service? You see, I think that's the part here that we can't minimize, you know?
It's a delicate balance. There's no question about it. I mean, maybe team sports is a good example to use, you know, the way they kind of work together and, like that's the delicate balance. And again, you know, I talk about yoga practice a lot because, like yoga practice is kind of all about sort of defining and getting in touch with individual parts of yourself, like your individual body parts. And the more each individual part can kind of function independently, the more it actually adds to the whole. You know, you contribute more to society the more you're able to kind of maintain your distinction. You know, when you become like a blur, you know, you don't really add, you add less, you know, because I mean, it's about growing. Like, you know, people need to grow. You know, I think it was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, when he talked about self-actualization. I mean, you know, like we need to bounce ideas like off of one another, you know, so that, you know, each of us can then help develop, you know, the other person so that we become, you know, more of our better unique self, like while still, you know, belonging and you know, being part of a group. It's definitely a delicate balance. There's no question about it. I mean, to me,
I think that we find, and you know, in foreign policy, and particularly what comes to mind is the apology that the New York Times did on its editorial page. It apologized to its readership, and I guess to the American culture, that they did not give critical analysis to entering the Iraq War. They just gave sort of an okay and a carte blanche to the Bush administration as it prepared for its shock and awe and its all of these silly preparations, so that we could be on an escapade of looking for, you know, weapons of mass destruction, and they just gave them a bye. And when this is what I think what you're talking about, if there can be a fine line when all the parts move together and work collaboratively and cooperatively, then there's kind of then we defer to, you know, to leadership that's been received all of our agency. You know, we think that that's a good idea. But when that system doesn't work, Catherine, we find ourselves in a real pickle, because you can find yourself doing some pretty awful things in the name of, you know, the stars and stripes. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing how badly this our national policies can become if one or two or just a few forces take control of things. I mean, I'm thinking of the Koch brothers and Alec right now. They really do. They really, with their fortune and their preferences, are making decisions for us and usurping power and putting things out of balance.
Right.
And there doesn't seem to be enough of an outcry to counter that.
Right.
There's a great Buddhist exercise. You get up in the morning and you say, you look in the mirror, you say, I'm not my nose, I'm not my ears, I'm not my mouth, I'm not my heart, I'm not my knees, I'm not my kidney, I'm not this. In other words, the point is, it's another way of saying what you're saying before. I'm not any one individual thing. I'm the summation of many different things. And all these things, all these organs have to work in concert with each other. And if any one of these things starts to, any one of the parts of us, even in the national politic, start to move independently, and accrue power, you know, to itself or himself or herself, then the collaboration just falls apart. And right now we're not in a very good place in the United States, I don't think, collaboratively.
Right. So, I mean, it's clear that we need to challenge the powers that be. Like, that's what I'm saying, gone unchallenged. And if we're just going to always be blindly following their orders, like, this is what we get.
Yes.
But, George, we have like 5 minutes left. And
oh, boy. I was worried that we wouldn't have enough to talk about.
I wanted to just really briefly talk about, because I went down there today and I ended up not being able to find it. The trial of Cecily McMillan, the occupier who they're trying to give her 7 years.
Yeah. Oh dear God. Oh, I'm so sorry about this.
So
it wasn't at 100 Center Street? You didn't go down there?
No, I went to 100 Center Street and I looked at the calendar and it said it was in Part C, and I went there and I thought, because I did get there like a bit late, so I thought they just had it in the morning and it was over. But it's going to be tomorrow morning also at 9:30, so I'm going to go tomorrow morning 9:30 at 100 Center Street. And for those who don't know this case, I mean, her trial started in February. The trial began Manhattan Criminal Court in February for Occupy Wall Street activist Cecily McMillan, who faces second-degree assault charges.
She had a seizure, for God's sakes.
Yeah, the cop grabbed her from behind, and just out of reflex, she elbowed the guy in the face. And these cops do this stuff on purpose, to antagonize. So, stemming from a 2012 encounter with the NYPD that left her beaten and unconscious. Trial had been postponed until March 3rd, due to introduction of illuminating new evidence. McMillan was brutally arrested on the evening of March 17th, 2012, at an event marking the 6-month anniversary of the group's occupation of Zuccotti Park. The series of events leading up McMillan's beating was documented extensively by the press and began with plainclothes male NYPD officer forcibly grabbing her right breast. McMillan was 23 years old at the time. I mean, so for accidentally elbowing a cop in the face, they're trying to give her 7 years? I mean, that's like insane. Like,
yeah, but the DA does this crap. I have a very good friend who had a pair of scissors in his pocket. He was cutting the tape, to cut the tape, around Zuccotti, and he was arrested. And the cop cut himself on the scissors, and the cop in the report put down that he was attacked by this protester with the scissors. Now, I want to tell you, this is the kind of, you can't make this stuff up. This is just, and so the DA diddled around, screwed around, postponed, and it hasn't been dismissed, but it winds up being reformatted, so they make an agreement out of trial so that some other kind of community service is done or something like that. I bet that some of that's going on now. When they say new evidence has been discovered, I hope to God that that's the kind of thing that's happening, that somebody's wiser souls are involved here to make some decision about this poor person.
I think really it's awful. It's mind-blowing to think that they're trying to give this girl, I think she's 25, right, she's 25 now, 7 years in jail. I mean, it's like, who's the criminal? Not this girl, the injustice system that has still yet to even, close the case for the Central Park 5 either. But I won't go there. But, if people find out more information, there's justiceforcecily.com. So it's Justice, the number 4,
Yeah.
CECILY.com. And there's also a Facebook page, I believe. It's Justice for Cecily on Facebook, and people can find information. And I'm going to be there tomorrow at 9:30. I know it's been kind of going on for like a week or two, and I haven't been able to get down there yet. But
I'm glad that you're making that announcement. I'm really glad.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bishop George Packard.
Okay, dear. Thank you so much for all your work.
And I'll see
you in the streets.
Yeah, May Day, Thursday.
Hey, good.
Okay.
Stop.
Thank you.
Okay, solid. Take care.
Okay.
Onward.
Onward, definitely.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you all for tuning in. I usually don't get a chance to kind of, give the last words before, we hang up, because I usually take it to the very last second. But, fight the good fight. We have to resist. It's just think of it like a diet and exercise program. You don't have to do it all. Just start. Just start to resist today. Thank you.